watch what happens. Okay, great. So, thank you all so much for being here. And I use products by this company, Apple, every day. My job exists because my company is built on the Apple platform. So it's sort of like, somebody works in the product design division. I don't know if you noticed this, but he basically did a Jedi trick on all of us where he was basically like, Dan says, this guy works at Apple in the product design division. And then this guy's like, I'm going to tell you tricks to get people to, sort of listen to you. And he never said anything about the amazing shit he must be working on that we don't know anything about. And we still don't know anything about, and that's his job. His job is to work on the amazing shit and come here and not tell us anything about it. So that's very awesome. And then I had no idea, Adam, that you had registered the domain that Dan Frank gave me earlier when I was getting his email address, and you had wired up the T with the Walter Kyle, and so I'm in good company. And beforehand, chatting with all of you to realize that we all have our paths and stories, and so I feel very fortunate that I get to now inflict my path on you, and you are some of you are going to sit there, and some of you may get itchy and leave. Katerina, you have that benefit to go to.
I know.
You can, So thank you very much. So my name's Justin Hall. I'm from the class of 1993, and I exploited every opportunity and stage that Parker gave to me, and I feel extremely grateful to have had all this opportunity to have rehearsed speaking in front of people and convincing them of things, and listening to you, Adam, in particular, describe this platform that Parker gave kids as a place to sort of, get up in front of adults and try and persuade them of things. It's like, I don't think most schools are architected that way, and then Andy Kaplan being like, yeah, go tell the adults what you think, and being like, oh my God, yeah, I'll go do that. So I'm grateful for that, and that's why I came here, and that's why I signed up for a reoccurring credit card donation to Parker, which, having listened to Dan Frank, I'm thinking I should up the amount. So I'm going to, my talk today is basically describing a bit of the path that I've had through the San Francisco technology scene. So hopefully this will lead to a juicy QA where we can try and ferret out what you're working on and whether your future lies in San Francisco or Chicago and so forth. So I'm 37 years old, and in 1981 my mother purchased an Apple II Plus computer that I was able to use for to entertain myself. Basically, it was sort of like having a friend that never got tired of you, and you could play with it and sort of explore virtual worlds and play with yourself and play with it at the same time, and be. I was so excited by all of that, and Parker, around maybe a few years later, I was in first grade then, and maybe by sixth grade or something, Parker was like, we have typing class, and so we would go into a room where they had WordPerfect and some computers with blue screens and white text, and we would go in there and practice typing exercises and get good at typing. And by eighth grade, it was clear that these computer things were really catching on, and so we started having computer class where they'd be like, okay, you're going to open up a spreadsheet and learn how to put numbers in a spreadsheet. And I sort of figured that out, and then I got this game called Leisure Suit Larry, which was basically about this guy trying to get lucky and have sex, which of course, I was in eighth grade. It was a while before I was going to have sex. And so, but I played this game in class, which was fun, and the teacher was I think amused enough by me bringing extra software into class that she allowed me to demo it for other students, which I think was wildly inappropriate, but very progressive. And so that was a good memory, although I have a slightly sadder memory about computers at Parker, which was that I was prone to trains of thought and then speaking those trains of thought. So I remember sitting in Peter Barrett's freshman algebra class and saying to Mr. Barrett, he was sort of talking about some equations or something that were on the blackboard. I had actually been talking to John Leary about his experience of the 1960s. I loved the sort of personal stories of the teachers, and I remember Mr. Leary talking. He said, I never went to Woodstock. I didn't really participate in that, so I raised my hand in class, and Mr. Leary had said, there's all sorts of things I missed in the 60s, so I was curious about Peter Barrett. So I said, Mr. Barrett, did you go to Woodstock? He was like, no, and then he went back to keyboard, and in his sort of brusque manner, he carried on, and then I was remembering further deeper into my conversation with John Leary, and so I was like, well, Mr. Barrett, and he was like, yes, Justin. I was like, did you ever have gonorrhea? Because that's what John Leary had said. I missed out on the 60s. I never went to Woodstock. I never had gonorrhea. So I was like, well, let me check up with Peter Barrett on this. So Mr. Barrett dismissed me from his class for like 3 weeks. And when he started teaching, I think one of the very first programming classes at Parker in Pascal, he let it be known that I was not allowed to take that class. So I missed out on the first programming class at Parker, but I was fortunate in that my family retained the services of a babysitter who had access to the internet in 1988, and he was willing to share it with me. And so I was emailing the world as Larry Gray in 1988, and so I wrote a breathless, very excited article for the Parker Weekly in 1991 that was basically like, I have found the internet, and it is filled with other people who do all kinds of freaky shit, and it is awesome. You will not believe the breadth of information you will have access to if you can get access to Usenet news groups. And it's all in text, but man, there's just every single thing you ever want to see is there on the internet. And many years later, I was very proud of having written my first published article about the internet in 1991, sort of, in the early wave of hype. So I left Parker and I went to Swarthmore College in Pennsylvania in 1993. And I remember I was, loved computers, and I opened up the New York Times in December, and they said, oh, there's this thing called a web browser. It's called Mosaic, and you can surf the web, and you can click on these things that you've been reading in text. You can now use a mouse and click on them. And I thought, oh my God, this is really something. I've got to check this out. And so I went to check out this web thing, and I looked at the web, and it was filled with silliness. It was filled with all kinds of people posting pictures of their poodles, and it's like this technology is so new and so splendid, but it cannot be that expensive or difficult to buy. It cannot be that expensive or difficult because these people are doing such useless things with it. So I thought, I'm going to join them. I want to do useless things. And so in the early days of 1994, I began posting sort of just pictures of me and my friends, and like my Parker buddies that visited me in college, and I posted our pictures. And I posted up lists of things that I found on the internet that were remarkable, that were amazing because at that time, you could surf what felt like the entire web in about 2 weekends, because you could see the outer bounds of it, because they had lists of the new sites. So it's like, here are the sites that have become new. In the last week, this organization started a website, and this other company decided to go on the web. You were like, oh, there's 50 new sites this week. Let's look at them all. Oh, these 45 suck, and these 5 are like really interesting. Maybe there's a jazz piece from some kid who's posted their thing. And, wow, let's check it out. And so I was like, oh man, but it's growing, and there's nowhere to go. There weren't search engines, there weren't directories. So it's like, I'll just make lists of shit that I like, and I'll post them online. And then I started getting tons of traffic, and I'm like 19, I'm in my dorm room, I'm like jamming on the weekends, like posting these lists of links, and I'm like, man, people from NASA are looking at my site, and like people from the military, and like, people from schools all over the world, and I'm like, I'm gonna make them read my poetry. And then I'm like, I post a bunch of terrible poems that I've written, or the good ones I put in Phaedrus, our literary magazine at Parker, and I've excerpted some of those, and then, you post a bunch of that stuff, and then I wanted to stitch it together. It's like, okay, so you've met this random stranger on the internet, you've seen his picture, you've seen the internet sites he likes, you've seen his poems. Who is this guy? I'm like, well, I'll just tell people about who I am and stitch these poems together. So I started writing basically a connective biography, and it was great because, as Adam mentioned, the structure of the web's nonlinear. I mean, you could use hypertext and HTML to make nonlinear stuff. So you could be like, I'm Justin, and I dated this girl, and we met at school, and I came here from Chicago, and my mom lives in Chicago, my dad's there too, but he's dead, and where'd he die, and what happened afterwards, and here's a poem, and you could just have all that stuff, and people could eat what they want. And so I put all that stuff up, and had a super great time. And now I'll rewind. I'm in Parker. No, I leave Parker. I'm probably on my way to La Petite, a coffee shop across the street. And I see this bus go by, and it's got a picture of like this Dayglow banner ad on it. It's like Wired, the magazine of the future or something. I'm like, oh, that sounds interesting. I wander over to Tower Records. I'm like totally dating myself. I go to a record store where they sell magazines. And I purchase a copy of this first issue of Wired magazine. I'm like, this is fucking bitchin'. It's like the first computer magazine I've ever seen with people on the cover. Like, what a thing to put people on the cover of a technology magazine. It's like what you said, like technology, you can sort of go with the data, but there's people on the other side of all of it, you know? So I look in the front, I see there's a phone number, I get on the payphone in the Parker lobby, and I call up the number that's listed in the front page of Wired, and I'm like, I dial up, it's like the editor-in-chief's answering machine or whatever, and I'm like, hey, I'm Justin, I live in Chicago, I'm in high school, but I'm totally connected to the hacker underground. Sort of true, but not really. And I'm like, I totally can write it all up for your magazine. And I never got a call back. But then when I was in college, I'm like, oh man, I really want to go after this Wired magazine thing. I really want to work for this Wired. They seem totally amazing. So I tried 4 times to work at Wired. The first time I tried, I was like, I want to be an editorial intern. And they're like, oh no, yeah, we're cool, we're full. I was like, I'll be a design intern. And they're like, yeah, no, that's cool, thanks. And then I called up and I was like, I want to be a custodial intern. And they're like, no, janitorial's totally handled. So then I called back and I said, well, you have a website and so do I. And they're like, oh, we'll connect you with our web team. And I talked to the web editor and she was like, oh yeah, okay, if you have a website, that's cool, yeah. Right on. I was like, yeah, I'll give you the URL right now. Let's stay on the phone. I want you to look at it. And then I told her the URL, and it was kind of remarkable then for somebody to have a website. So she's like, oh, okay, I'll look at your website. And she looked at it, and right on the front page, like before you got too far down, was a picture I'd found surfing the web of Cary Grant was part of the CIA's tests with LSD. And so I had a picture right on my front page. It was like a big picture of Cary Grant putting a small tab of acid on his tongue. And she cracked up and was like, you are culturally aligned, like, let's do this thing. So I got the internship. And that really started what became like a I guess, love affair, obsession, like connection to this city. Because I came here in 1994 and I was like, oh my God, all these people are lit up by technology and they wear freaky clothes. And the weed is so much better out here than it was in Chicago. And like, the food is better and like everybody's just building the future together. This is amazing. I gotta be here. And so basically, like, since 1994, I've lived here on and off, and I wrote out this whole outline of all this other shit I was going to talk about, but I've taken so long to say all this stuff. But I basically worked for a series of startups in San Francisco, and one startup was called Electric Minds in 1996, and I slept on the office floor in a building that I now work in and wear a suit every day. And another company I worked for when I got out of college, I was the 20th employee. They went within 9 months. They went to 110 employees, and then 3 months later they were down to 20 again. They laid everybody off. I was laid off by voicemail from that internet startup. I then took advantage of my free time to learn some Japanese, and I moved to Japan in 2001. And I got there like 2 months before the first 3G mobile phone came out. And so in December of 2001, I'm holding a mobile phone in my hand that has a video link live to somebody else with the mobile phone. I'm video chatting with somebody on the mobile phone. I mean, in 11 years ago. So, there's a famous writer who said, William Gibson, who said, the future has already arrived, it's just unevenly distributed. So I was able to get to Tokyo when you could sell just what was happening on the streets of Tokyo. I could peddle that to people in English language newspapers and magazines, just be like, yo, check it out, I got a phone, I'm talking to people, it's like Dick Tracy, video crazy, pay me. So I did that for a couple years, and then eventually I was like, it's kind of sad ultimately to just write about other people making stuff. I want to make stuff. So I went to school. I went back to school. I went to graduate school at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles, and over the course of 3 years in the film school, I learned how to produce software, and I was working on my final project, which was this idea that we all surf the web every day. Maybe you guys have web browsers and you use them to check your email or research news or look up vacations. You do all sorts of things in your web browsers. And at the same time as you're doing that, your friends and family and people you don't know are all using their web browsers as well. And what if you were all connected to each other at the same time, surfing and sort of passing each other information? How could you build a sort of a social web browser experience? Well, maybe you could do that by making a game out of exchanging information across the web. And so with this very small team, including my girlfriend and this programmer, we built a toolbar for Firefox that as you surfed, it would show you where other people had been and they'd left traps or treasure on the websites you'd been to. And so we sort of built that in the school context, and then someone saw me talk about it and they were like, that's a startup. And I was like, whoa, startup, really? Because I'd worked for a bunch of companies before and it seemed like they had their shit together. I mean, they laid me off by phone, sure, but like they were like organized and business people and stuff, and I'm just a guy with an idea. They're like, no, that's a startup. So my girlfriend and I, we raised $2 million and we hired 9 people, and we were like, when we were raising the money, they were like, why are you here in LA? We want to give you $500,000, but you have to move to San Francisco. We're like, no, LA is cheaper, and it's warmer, and it's nice here, and our dog likes it. And they're like, no, the engineers and the connections and the people you want to meet are here. So we moved up to the Bay Area. We raised this money. We hired all these people, and then we got married. And then our idea, the economy cratered, and nobody was going to give us any more money, because this is just a brief glimpse. For those of you who aren't in the technology industry, basically many startups are, you try and raise a lot of money when you don't really know what you're doing. And then over time, you use that money to build a team, and then by the time you have a great team in place, people are like, oh wow, that team is amazing. Now we'll give you more money, or we'll buy you, or you're successful. So we didn't do any of those things. We built a decent team, and then we ran out of money, and then the company failed. I had to lay everybody off, myself included, and lay off people who'd given up their jobs to work for me. That was like the most humbling, sad time, next to when the whole board voted to replace me as CEO, including my wife. And then, so then we shut down the company. I go to get another job to lick my wounds, and 6 months later I'm divorced. So it was like this full cycle of like business and life and taking on challenges and failing. And what is failure? It's the opportunity to miss out on being really angry, or making somebody really angry who you live with and love. So I then took a job at this firm called NG MoCo, and NG MoCo stands for Next Generation Mobile Company. And NG MoCo was started by some people who saw the iPhone in 2008 and said, holy smokes, this is going to eat Nintendo's lunch. Let's make games for this thing. So we started making games for the iPhone. I started there as a producer. I made the famous game that you have all heard of called Touch Pets Cats, which is, if you haven't heard of it, those of you who are chuckling have heard of it, and those who haven't heard of it, it's basically one of the best cat simulators ever produced for the iPhone. There were like 1,500 people who really enjoyed that thing. And then as on the side, I was sort of like, you know, all these people I work with are super fascinating. I want to write about them and get them to introduce each other. So I started an employee newsletter on the side, and they said, you know, eventually they're like, Justin, you're okay with this game producing stuff, but the newsletter, that's what, you're good at the newsletter. So now my job is Director of Culture and Communications. I make videos and make newsletters and align people with the purpose of the organization and try to figure out why we get out of bed and put on clothes and come to work, because it's optional every day. And you have the choice to do what you want, and people choose to show up at our workplace, and I try to make that make sense for myself and other people. So on the side, I'm writing, I was sort of writing 2 memoirs, but now I've fused them and I'm writing a single memoir. Basically after my company tanked and I was on the skids with my relationship, I was alone a lot with a lot of time to think, and I wrote a very long, basically everything that I would want to know if I was trying to do an internet startup. So I wrote all this thing out, and I got permission from the investors and everything. I published the contracts and the term sheets and the financing documents. So if you're ever like want to see the curtain pulled back on what an internet startup looks like, I wrote it. And I published it for free on the web, and then I put it in the Kindle store, so it's an ebook. And right now there are Google AdWords running that advertise the ebook, but the ebook sells for $2.99. I make $1.99 off of each ebook that sells. I spend $1.30 acquiring customers on Google through AdWords. It's all this kind of business math stuff that's not, you know, but I'm into it. And so I'm thinking, like, if this job doesn't work out, my next thing, I'm going to publish my memoir and then maximize the sort of advertising equation to, like, right now I've figured out the advertising. I've got it tuned. I'm getting like between 0.75 and 1.25 customers per week. And I'm figuring I could triple that if I was unemployed and just solely focused on that. So that's sort of where I'm going professionally. But and that's yes. So thank you very much.